The morning Violet Ashworth walked through Ashworth Hall for what she believed was the last time as its mistress, she carried nothing but a candle, because the sun had not yet risen, and she knew every room by touch. She moved through the blue drawing room with its holland covers already draped over the chairs, past the long dining table where the candlelight caught the dust settling back into undisturbed air, up the oak staircase where her father's portrait hung in the second alcove and would likely be taken down before the month was out. She had not wept. She had done her weeping in September, when the solicitor's letter arrived, and again in October, when the entail was confirmed, and the male cousin she had met precisely twice came through the front door with a surveyor at his heel. There was, after that, a limit to how many times the same loss could surprise you into tears. She had reached that limit. What remained was the daily work of continuing. And the daily work was, at 23 years old, the only inheritance the law had seen fit to leave her. The entail, as Mr. Greer had explained it with the careful gentleness of a man paid to deliver news he did not enjoy delivering, was quite ordinary. Ashworth Hall and its 300 acres passed to the nearest male heir upon her father's death. Her father had known this. Her father had, in fact, spent the last decade quietly hoping for a son, and then quietly hoping that Parliament might oblige him with a reform it never delivered, and then quietly dying in November, without having accomplished either. The cousin, having no attachment to the land and a sensible appreciation for what a prosperous merchant would pay for a well-maintained estate in a county with reasonable shooting, had sold within 6 weeks. The new owner had not yet appeared. Violet remained, by the sufferance of no one in particular, as the woman who answered correspondence, paid the quarterly wages, received the tenant farmers who came to the kitchen door, and kept the ledgers in the clear. Even hand her father had praised when she was 12 years old. She had told herself, in the weeks since the sale was confirmed, that she was not afraid of the new owner. She had told herself this with the same quiet determination she applied to most things she was, in fact, afraid of. His name was Daniel Erickson. She had learned this from Mr. Greer's second letter, which noted that Mr. Erickson was a merchant of considerable means, of Anglo-Swedish parentage, with interests in Baltic trade and a recent decision to establish himself more permanently in English county society. He was 31 years old, and he was unmarried. Mr. Greer had included this last detail without apparent awareness of its implications, or with an exceedingly professional awareness of its implications, which amounted to the same thing. Violet had noted it, and set it aside. She set aside a great many things in those weeks, because the alternative was to stand in the kitchen garden in November cold, and understand all at once that her father's death had not simply left her without a parent, but without a name that mattered, without a place that was hers, without the particular ground beneath her feet that had constituted her sense of where she ended and the world began. She set this aside, and counted the winter stores instead, and found them adequate, and wrote it in the ledger in her own hand, with the date and her name in the corner, as she always did. Violet Ashworth. She had written it in the corner of every quarterly ledger for 8 years, since she had taken over the household accounts from Mrs. Hadley, the former housekeeper, who had taught her the system and then declined sharply and died in the spring. Nan had come after Mrs. Hadley. Nan, whose full name was Anne Corby, and who had served the Ashworth family for 4 decades, and who had the particular loyalty of a person who has outlasted everyone she might otherwise have served. Nan was 62 years old and disapproved of the new owner on principle, sight unseen, because the new owner was not Miss Violet, and that was the whole of her objection. "He'll want you gone," Nan had said, not unkindly, On the morning, Mr. Greer confirmed the sale. They always want the last one gone. Reminds them of what they purchased. Violet had said that she intended to remain until she was asked to leave, and that she intended, when asked to leave with her head level. Nan had said that she would believe it when she saw it. She had seen it. As it turned out, because Daniel Erickson arrived on a gray Tuesday in early December with a single manservant and a surveyor's map tucked under his arm, and he walked through the front door of Ashworth Hall, and Violet met him in the entrance hall with her hands folded and her back straight. And she was, in the technical sense, entirely level. He was taller than she had expected. This was the first thing she noticed, and she noticed it as a practical matter. The chandelier that hung in the entrance hall was lower on the left side than the right, a consequence of a bracket replaced after a storm 3 years ago, and she had grown accustomed to warning male visitors about it. She would need to warn him. He had dark hair and a face that seemed composed at the outset, of very little expression, as though the muscles responsible for it had been given other work to do. His eyes were gray and attentive in the way that made some people feel observed rather than seen. He wore a coat that was good without being fashionable, which told her something about him, though she was not yet sure what. "Miss Ashworth," he said. His voice was low and even. The slight formal precision of his consonants was the only audible mark of his Swedish parentage, and it was not, she found, unpleasant. "Mr. Erickson." She did not add anything further. There was nothing further that was hers to add. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had expected to find something other than what he found. He did not say what he had expected. He asked to see the estate ledgers. She showed him the ledgers. She had left them on the library table, 3 years' worth, in the correct order, with a summary she had prepared at the front in case the new owner preferred a condensed account. He sat down and read for an hour without speaking. She sat across the table and waited, because she had nowhere else to be, and because to leave would have suggested a discomfort she was not willing to confess. It was during this hour that he saw it for the first time. He looked up from the second ledger, and his gaze went not to her, but to the lintel of the library door, where her father had had her name carved in 1809 when she turned 11, and her father had decided, with the cheerful illogic of an affectionate man, that carving a child's name in oak was a reasonable way to mark a birthday. The letters were still clean. Violet had kept them so. He looked at the carving for some time. He did not look back at the ledger immediately. "This is your name," he said. "Yes." She waited a beat. "My father had it put there. I was a child." She offered no further explanation because he had not asked for one, and because the carving required no explanation she could give without conceding ground she intended to keep. He returned to the ledger. He did not mention it again that evening. But she noticed later that when he left the library, he paused in the doorway a second time and looked up. 3 days after his arrival, Lady Mowbray came. Lady Mowbray was 60 years old and moved through the world with the particular confidence of a woman whose position in the local hierarchy had never been seriously tested. She was a distant cousin of Violet's father, which gave her a lateral connection to Ashworth Hall without giving her any claim upon it, a distinction she had always managed to blur when blur was useful. She arrived in a carriage with Miss Cecily Frome at her side, because she arrived nowhere without Miss Cecily Frome. Cecily was 20 years old and very fair, and wore a pelisse the color of winter sky that cost more than Violet spent on household supplies in 6 months. And she had the particular quality of a young woman who has been told since infancy that she is the correct choice, so consistently that she had stopped bothering to wonder whether correctness was the same thing as worth. Nan let them in. Violet came down the stairs to receive them, and Lady Mowbray looked at her with the expression of a woman who had rehearsed this scene on the drive over. "My dear Violet," she said. "Still here?" "Lady Mowbray." Miss Frome. Violet received them with the same composed equanimity she had practiced for 3 years, through the late Mrs. Hadley's decline, through her father's final illness, through the surveyor and the cousin, and the solicitor's letter. It had the advantage of being genuine, which made it easier to sustain. Daniel joined them in the drawing-room. Lady Mowbray received him with the full arsenal of county warmth, the kind of warmth that feels like welcome and functions as evaluation, and she began immediately to make herself indispensable. This family's connection to that one, this tenant's particular difficulty, this route to the magistrate when the matter of the northern fence arose. She was excellent at it. It was, Violet thought, without malice, her genuine talent. During a pause in the conversation, when Nan had brought in tea and was withdrawing, Lady Mowbray said, in the carrying voice she never quite regulated, "Of course, you will have to decide what is to be done about the squatter situation." The room adjusted itself around the word. Nan did not turn. Violet, sitting near the window with her tea untouched in her saucer, did not shift in her chair by so much as a degree. She had learned, with the precision of long practice, how to receive a word like that, without allowing it to reach the places inside her it was meant to reach. Daniel looked at Lady Mowbray. He looked at Violet. He said nothing. But Violet felt, in the quality of his silence, something that was not indifference. She did not trust what she felt. She had reasons not to trust it, reasons that lived in the practical certainty that she was 23 years old, dispossessed by untail, reliant on the sufferance of the man who now owned everything she had ever called her own. And that romantic interpretation of another person's silence was the kind of thinking women in her position could not afford. She was, in all the ways that mattered legally and socially, nothing here. The days that followed were their own peculiar form of negotiation, conducted entirely in the register of ordinary household life. Daniel moved through Ashworth Hall with the thoroughness of a man who had purchased something and was learning its dimensions from the inside out. He interviewed the tenant farmers. He walked the property lines. He sat with the estate map in the evenings and asked Violet questions she answered directly and without excess. She noticed that he asked her questions the surveyor had already answered, and she noticed that he listened to her answers with a quality of attention that was different from his attention to the surveyor. But she placed this observation in the category of things she set aside, where it remained alongside the entail and the December cold and the carved oak lintel and 4 years of daily work performed without a witness. It was on a Thursday afternoon, 4 days after Lady Mowbray's visit, that the schoolroom door was ajar. Violet had maintained the schoolroom on the hall's east wing for 2 years. The tenant farmers had children, 7 of them between the ages of 6 and 13, and there was no parish school within practical walking distance, and her father had never minded. And when her father died, she had simply continued, because the children had continued, because the alternative was that Thomas Hartley, who was 9 and quick with figures, and little Mary Brent, who was 6, and learning her letters with a ferocious solemnity, would have no one at all. The supplies cost 12 shillings a month, which she paid from the small quarterly allowance her father had settled on her before he died, and which she had, with careful management, not yet exhausted. She had told no one the amount. She had told no one, really, that she paid it herself. It simply wanted doing, and she was the person present to do it. She had not known Daniel was in that part of the house. He had said at breakfast that he intended to walk the Northfields. She had therefore not closed the schoolroom door, and she had not modulated her voice for an audience she did not know she had, and when she heard a sound in the corridor and looked toward the doorway, she found him standing there with the Northfield map still rolled under his arm and the expression on his face of a man who had not expected to find what he found. 7 children sat at the long table. Mary Brent had her slate. Thomas Hartley had Violet's father's old primer open before him, and was reading aloud in the careful way of a boy who understood that the words mattered. The others were in various states of attention, as children are, but they were present, and they were warm, and the room smelled of chalk dust and the pine resin from the small iron stove in the corner that Violet had persuaded a reluctant footman to install in October. Violet held Daniel's gaze for 3 seconds. She did not apologize for being found. She said, quite calmly, that she would finish in 20 minutes and that the room was at his disposal after that if he needed it. Then she turned back to the children, because they were looking at the tall stranger in the doorway with the bright, greedy interest of children who do not see strangers often, and Mary Brent had lost her place on the slate. He was gone when she came out of the schoolroom. She found him in the library an hour later, seated not at the table, but in the chair near the window, the Northfield map now open across his knee, not reading it. He looked up when she entered. "How long?" he said. It was not quite a question. 2 years. You pay for the supplies. She did not ask how he knew. The estate does not provide for it. The children require it. She went to the shelves and took down the household record she had come to find. She did not look at him while she said, "I have 12 shillings a month set aside for it. It is not a drain on the estate accounts. It will not appear on any ledger you need concern yourself with." He was quiet. When she did look at him, he was watching her with the gray, attentive expression that she had learned in the 12 days of his residence to read as something other than coldness. She had not yet decided what to call it in the reading. "I intend to continue it," he said, with the flat, declarative certainty he brought to most practical decisions. "The cost will come from the estate accounts from January." She held the household record against her chest. "That is your choice to make," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." She did not know, standing in the library with her father's house breathing around her, and her name in the oak above the door, and the snow beginning outside the window, that Nan had given him a letter that morning. She would not know until the following week, when Nan told her with the blunt tenderness of a woman who had decided that Violet had been ignorant of the matter long enough. The letter had been written 4 years ago by a woman who had known Daniel in Bristol, and it concerned his wife. Her name had been Clara. She had died in childbed in the spring, while Daniel was at sea on a passage from Stockholm, 3 days out when the wind turned against him, and another 4 days before he could make port. By the time he reached Bristol, Clara was buried, and the child, a son who had lived only hours, buried with her. He had stood in a churchyard in April rain, and understood himself to be a man who had been given the thing he most valued, and had been absent at the moment it required his presence, and he had carried that understanding across 4 years and 2 continents, and had set it down. Apparently, at the moment he walked through the door of Ashworth Hall and found a woman who had stayed precisely where she was needed, for years, asking nothing, witnessed by no one. Violet did not know this yet. She knew only what she could observe. That he was not unkind. That his commands functioned as protection even when she read them as instruction. That he looked at her name above the library lintel, with an expression she could not quite parse, and that in 12 days he had given her no reason to leave, and no reason to hope. Which was, in her experience, the most confusing combination a man could produce. Lady Mowbray returned on a Friday with a letter. She arrived without Miss Frome, which Violet noted as a change of strategy rather than a softening of intention. She was received by Daniel in the drawing room. Violet was not invited, and did not insert herself. She was in the corridor outside the housekeeper's room with Nan when she heard the drawing room door close. "The letter," Nan said, without looking up from the linen she was counting, "will be about removing you." Violet did not ask how Nan knew. Nan always knew. The letter was from Lady Mowbray's solicitor, and urged, in the polished language of legal propriety, that the continued presence of Miss Ashworth under the Hall's roof constituted a social irregularity that would hinder Mr. Erickson's reception in the county, impede his prospects for an appropriate alliance, and invite speculation of the most damaging kind. It suggested, with the delicate authority of professional advice, that the matter ought to be resolved before the county season began in February. Lady Mowbray presented this to Daniel at a dinner 3 evenings later, a dinner to which she had invited the Frome family and 2 neighboring families, and which Violet attended in the plain dove-gray gown that was her best, and which had been her best for 4 years. The dining room was warm with candlelight, and the conversation was the careful, multi-layered exchange of people who are enjoying themselves and also conducting business, and Violet was quiet in her place near the end of the table with the particular stillness of a woman who has learned to occupy a room in a way that makes her easy to overlook. It was during dessert that Lady Mowbray said, addressing the table generally, but directing her gaze at Daniel with the practiced aim of a woman who knew how to use a room. Of course, it is quite generally agreed that poor Violet cannot remain indefinitely. The squatter's position, however understandable given the circumstances, does complicate matters terribly. 4 guests at the table. 2 of them Violet had known since childhood. Neither looked at her directly. This was the particular social cruelty she had learned to expect from people who were not cruel so much as comfortable, and comfort, in her experience, was more durable than cruelty. Daniel looked at Lady Mowbray. He looked at his wineglass. He said nothing. Violet, watching him from the far end of the table, read his silence as agreement, and something in her chest that she had been careful not to name all these weeks settled quietly into the shape of a thing she had always suspected was true, that she would not, in the end, be chosen. She had known it in October, when the cousin arrived with his surveyor, and she had known it each time Lady Mowbray said "squatter" in that particular voice, and she had known it even while she told herself she did not know it, which was the kindest form of lying she had ever managed. The morning after the dinner, she packed. She packed with the same calm precision she brought to the household ledgers, because a composure that collapsed in private was no composure at all. She folded the gray gown and the cream wool she had mended twice at the cuffs, and the few books that were genuinely hers, and not the house's, and the miniature portrait of her father that had sat on her dressing table for 3 years. She wrote a short letter to Nan, which she left on the kitchen table, because she could not have said it aloud without her voice doing something she would not have permitted it to do. She arranged her quarterly accounts in the right order on the library table, with the summary at the front, for whoever came next. She left at 7 in the morning before Daniel was awake, or before she believed he was awake, and she walked the 6 miles to the coaching inn at Hartfield, because the road was clear, and she was cold but not dangerously so, and because walking was at least action, which was preferable to the alternative of standing in the entrance hall of Ashworth Hall with her bags and her 30-year-old father's portrait and waiting for someone to tell her what she already knew. The inn at Hartfield was called the Bell and Cross, and it was the kind of establishment that served the county's working population and traveling families and the occasional dispossessed daughter of a modest gentleman who had run out of road. The innkeeper's wife found her a chair near the fire and brought her tea without being asked, which was a kindness Violet felt more sharply than she had anticipated and had to manage carefully. She sat with her bags around her feet and her father's portrait face down on her lap and thought, with great deliberate plainness, about the practical question of what she did next. She had the remainder of her quarterly allowance, which was not nothing. She had her own capability, which was considerable. and which counted for far less than it should have in the world as it was constituted. She had Nan's letter, left on the kitchen table, not yet answered. She had no family to apply to, and no particular desire to apply to them in any case. She had, at 23 years old, the clear-eyed assessment of a woman who had survived enough already to know she would survive this, and the private grief of a woman who had hoped, once, just the once, against everything she knew about hoping. She had been sitting for perhaps an hour when the door of the Bell and Cross opened on a blast of December cold, and Daniel came in. He had ridden. She could see the cold in the color at his jaw, and the frost still caught in the wool of his coat. And he had covered 6 miles in weather that would have persuaded a careful man to send a note instead. He stood in the doorway of the inn for a moment, and she watched him find her in the room. And his face, when he found her, did something she had no ready word for. Something between relief and the particular expression of a man who has made a decision he does not intend to revisit. There were people in the inn. She was aware of them with the prickling social awareness she could not switch off even now. The innkeeper and his wife at the desk, 2 tenant farmers from the Aldbury estate at the corner table who would have recognized her and would certainly recognize the new owner of Ashworth Hall, a family from somewhere further north, waiting for the midday coach. A woman who might have been Lady Mowbray's housekeeper seated near the door. It was, in its modest way, an audience, which was either the worst or the best circumstance under which this conversation could occur. He crossed the room. He stood before her. He did not look at the audience. "You were not asked to leave," he said. His voice was level, the consonants precise, the gray eyes entirely steady. She looked up at him and kept her own voice, even with the effort it required. "I was not asked," she said. "I chose to spare you the asking. I did not want to be spared it." He stood with his hat in his hand and the cold coming off him in a slow, fading warmth, and he said, more quietly, the way a man says the thing he has decided to say without the protection of distance. "You know this house better than any living person. You know its tenants by name. You know which beam in the east wing needs seeing to before spring, and you have been paying 12 shillings a month for 7 children to learn their letters in a room you kept warm at your own cost, and you did not tell me, because you did not expect it to be relevant to anyone but you. I need you to understand that it is relevant to me." She was very still. The fire behind her gave warmth, and the room held its breath with the indiscreet, hopeful interest of a public space into which something private has been admitted. "As chatelaine," she said carefully, "you could engage any capable woman?" "Yes," he said. "I could." He paused, as though considering whether the next sentence required formality or whether they were already past it. "I am not asking for a chatelaine, Miss Ashworth." The woman near the door had gone quite motionless. The innkeeper had found something to polish at the furthest end of the bar from which he could still watch without appearing to. One of the Aldbury tenant farmers had put down his cup. Daniel looked at her with the expression she had spent 3 weeks trying to name, and had never quite managed, because it was the expression of a man who was seeing her plainly, and meant her to know he was seeing her. Without the deflection of rank or social formula, or the careful distance of a man who has been hurt, and has organized his life around not being hurt again. "There is a carved name above the library lintel," he said. "There are quarterly ledgers with your signature in the corner going back 8 years. There are 7 children in a warm room who know their letters because you decided they ought to. I have walked every acre of that estate, and your work is in the land as much as in the accounts." He stopped. He let the silence hold its shape for one long moment. Then he said, plain and level and irrevocable, the house already knows who it belongs to. It was not long. It was not elaborate. It landed in the room with the weight of something that had been true before it was said, and that the saying merely confirmed. One of the Aldbury farmers exhaled. It was not quite a sound. The woman near the door, who was indeed Lady Mowbray's housekeeper, and who would report this to her employer within the hour, had gone quite red around the collar. Violet looked up at him. She looked at him for long enough to be certain she was reading him correctly, with the carefully calibrated assessment of a woman who had taught herself not to hope for specific things and had been wrong, this once, to have been so careful. Then she said, quietly, the words she could not have said 8 weeks ago, when she had not yet known what it cost him to say the thing he had just said. I thought your silence meant you agreed with her. I know, he said. I am sorry for the silence. He said it without ceremony, and with the plainness of a man who understood what the silence had cost her, and intended, going forward, to be less economical. He offered her his hand. She took it. If you have found yourself holding your breath somewhere in Violet's story, you are not alone, and it would mean a great deal to have you stay for the ending. They returned to Ashworth Hall as the afternoon light was going. The road back was gray and cold, and the frost was coming on early, and Daniel kept his horse to a walk so that the hired carriage Violet had eventually agreed to take could manage the ruts, which was the kind of consideration that required no declaration and communicated everything a declaration might have said. Nan met them at the door. She looked at Daniel with the measured assessment of a woman who had spent 4 decades deciding whether people were worth her regard, and she said, after a moment, I'll have the fire lit in the drawing room, which was, from Nan, very close to an endorsement. The formal matter of it all required a fortnight. Mr. Greer came from town with the necessary papers and sat at the library table where Violet had so often sat, and confirmed, in the precise language of legal authority, that the arrangements were entirely sound and that there was no procedural impediment of any kind. He did this with the quiet satisfaction of a solicitor who had genuinely liked Violet's father and who had spent the last 2 months hoping for something that now appeared to be occurring. The neighboring families received the news with the variety of responses such news typically produces. Some with warmth, some with recalibration, and some with the particular silence of people who had used the word squatter in Violet's hearing, and were now rearranging their recollections of having done so. Lady Mowbray came, in the 3rd week of January, and received the information from Daniel directly. She sat very still in the blue drawing room, in the chair nearest the fire, and she listened. And when Daniel finished, she was quiet for a moment with the expression of a woman who had confidently played a hand she was certain was correct, and had discovered that the table had changed its rules sometime in the past several weeks without informing her. She looked at Violet. She said, with the fractional hesitation of a woman whose social fluency was recovering itself in real time, I see that I have been in error about the situation. She did not use the word squatter. She did not use it again. Miss Cecily Frome was in Bath by February, and the season found her 2 attentive young men from Wiltshire who were entirely suitable, and who had not, as far as anyone knew, been expected to belong to anyone else. She married the better of the 2 in April, in the church at Bath, and was reported to be quite happy, which Violet, who bore her no specific malice, was glad to hear. The winter settled into Ashworth Hall with the slow, deliberate permanence of something that has been waiting for permission. Snow came in February, the particular snow of a season that has been cold and dry for long enough that when it finally falls, it falls in earnest, covering the east garden and the kitchen garden and the long drive in a gray-white quiet that softened every edge the estate possessed. Violet stood at the window of the library, the window that looked north over the home field, and watched it come down in the late afternoon light with the feeling of a woman who has at last been permitted to stop bracing. The schoolroom in the east wing was warm. Daniel had seen to the east wing beam in January, before the hardest cold arrived, because Violet had written it in the December ledger with a note about the spring risk, and he had read her notes with the attention he gave everything she had written, which was the same attention he gave everything she said, which was the same attention she had spent 8 years not quite believing she would receive from anyone whose receiving of it mattered. Thomas Hartley was reading from a primer, now that was not old and not borrowed, because Daniel had sent to London for new ones in January, along with a set of slates that did not crack in the cold. Mary Brent had graduated from letters to simple sums, and regarded the transition with the same ferocious solemnity she had brought to everything else. Nan was in the kitchen below, where she had been for 40 years, and where, she had indicated with the serene certainty of a woman who knew her own value, she intended to remain. She had given Violet the full account of Daniel's wife in the week after the bell and cross, sitting at the kitchen table with the letter before them, speaking plainly and without embellishment about what it cost a man to be absent at the moment that had mattered most and what it produced in him afterward. Violet had listened and been quiet for a long time. Then she had said carefully that she understood why silence had been easier, and Nan had said that she had thought so, and that she had told him as much. The fire in the library grate snapped and threw a brief bright light across the room. Violet's name was still in the oak above the lintel, the letters as clean as they had ever been, the carving her father had put there when she was 11 years old, and he had been, in his unreliable, cheerful way, entirely certain that she was worth the marking. Daniel came into the library as the last of the afternoon light was failing. He carried the estate plan he had been revising all week, the one that incorporated the northeast drainage project the tenant farmer Brent had been requesting for 2 years and that Violet had noted in 3 separate ledgers with increasing urgency. He set it on the table and then did not look at it, because he was looking at her at the window. And she looked back at him with the quiet directness she had been practicing all her life. For a moment, she had not expected to arrive. Outside the window, the snow came down on the drive, and the garden and the 300 acres that the law had once insisted were not hers, and the fire gave warmth to a room that had her name in the door, and the house held around them with the settled, undemonstrative weight of a place that knew itself finally to be inhabited by the right people. She was home.